At its peak, Cammell Laird employed 12,000 men on the banks of the Mersey, building the aircraft carriers and battleships that armed 2 world wars. During the Second World War alone, the Birkenhead yard launched 106 warships, one every 20 days. Then, a single contract brought it down, a £50 million deal to lengthen an Italian cruise ship. The ship turned around mid-voyage. The bank pulled the funding, and a 13-deck steel midsection, £52 million of skilled men's work, was towed to the Netherlands and sold for scrap. Not through one failure, through 50 years of slow retreat that left the yard on a knife edge, and one contract that tipped it over. Chapter 1. The Scotsman and the Pool. The story begins where the Mersey widens, in a place that wasn't yet a town. In 1824, a boilermaker from Greenock named William Laird crossed the river from Liverpool, looked at the marshy inlet called Wallasey Pool, and saw something nobody else had bothered to see, a sheltered stretch of tidal water with enough depth to float iron. He wasn't a shipbuilder. Not yet. He'd come south with a man called Daniel Horton to set up an ironworks, making boilers and castings, the bread-and-butter metalwork of the early industrial age. Birkenhead in 1824 was almost nothing, a scattering of buildings around a medieval priory, a ferry crossing, and a great deal of mud. Liverpool across the water was already one of the richest ports on earth. Birkenhead was its afterthought. William Laird didn't build ships. His son did. John Laird was born in Greenock in 1805, raised in Liverpool, educated at the Royal Institution, and articled to a solicitor, a respectable career path for a Scottish merchant's eldest boy. He abandoned it at 23 to join his father at the ironworks. Within a year, he'd persuaded the old man to try something new. In 1829, the Birkenhead Ironworks launched a 60-ton iron lighter into Wallasey Pool. It wasn't much to look at, a flat-bottomed barge, functional rather than elegant. But it floated, and it was made of iron, and that mattered more than elegance in 1829. Iron ships were a curiosity. The Royal Navy didn't trust them. The Merchant Marine didn't want them. Wooden shipbuilders on the Thames and the Clyde dismissed the idea as a fad. Iron was heavier than timber. It fouled with marine growth, and everyone knew a cannonball would punch straight through a plate. John Laird built them anyway. By 1833, his yard had launched the Lady Lansdowne, a successful iron paddle steamer, and the orders were beginning to come. Not a flood, a trickle, but each vessel proved that iron hulls could be lighter for their strength, could carry more cargo for their displacement, and could survive groundings that would have splintered oak. His brother MacGregor took a different path with the same family ambition. MacGregor Laird became an Africa explorer and steamship pioneer, founding the African Steamship Company, later absorbed into Elder Dempster, the Liverpool line that would dominate the West Africa trade for a century. The Laird brothers, between them, were building ships and building the routes those ships would sail. William Laird died in 1841. John became sole partner and transformed the yard from a sideline into a purpose. The vessels grew larger, the contracts more prestigious. In 1840, the yard built the Dover, the first iron ship owned by the British government. In 1846, it launched HMS Birkenhead, a troop ship whose sinking off the Cape of Good Hope 6 years later would give the English language the phrase, "women and children first." And John Laird built more than ships. He became Birkenhead's first mayor, chairman of the Improvement Commission from 1833, champion of the dock scheme that would define the town's economy for a century. He funded St. James's Church, the Borough Hospital, the Laird School of Art, a set of dock cottages for his own workers. He lived at 63 Hamilton Square, a Georgian terrace so grand that the square around it holds Britain's highest concentration of Grade 1 listed buildings outside Trafalgar Square. When he retired from the yard in 1861, it was to become the first Member of Parliament for Birkenhead. Conservative, naturally. A seat he held until a riding accident killed him in October 1874. 3 years later, a bronze statue by the Irish sculptor Albert Bruce Joy was unveiled in Hamilton Square before a crowd estimated at 15,000. John Laird stands there still, holding the plans of his docks in his right hand, looking out over the town he'd willed into existence. By then, the yard was called Laird Brothers. John's 3 sons, William, John Jr., and Henry Hindman Laird, were running it, and the ships they were building had begun to carry guns. Chapter 2. Hull number 290. This is where the story turns strange. In 1862, with the United States tearing itself apart, a Confederate naval agent named Commander James Dunwoody Bullock arrived in Liverpool with money, a mission, and a legal loophole. The Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819 prohibited British subjects from equipping warships for a belligerent power, but said nothing about building an unarmed hull. Bullock found his way to Birkenhead through the Liverpool cotton broker Fraser, Trenholm and Company, placed an order with Laird brothers, and watched as the yard began construction on a vessel listed in the books simply as Hull number 290. She was built openly. Birkenhead workers riveted her plates, shaped her bow, fitted her engines, knowing full well what she was, or at least suspecting it. The American consul in Liverpool, Thomas Haynes Dudley, certainly knew. He gathered evidence, filed reports, and begged the Foreign Secretary, Lord Russell, to intervene. Russell hesitated. The Crown's law officer, Sir John Harding, was meant to rule on the case, but Harding was descending into mental illness, and the paperwork sat on his desk while the hull took shape on the Birkenhead slipway. On the 15th of May, 1862, Hull 290 was launched under the name Enrica, ostensibly a merchant vessel. British detention orders were finally drafted. They arrived too late. On the 29th of July, the Enrica slipped out of the Mersey on what was announced as a trial cruise, complete with champagne and ladies in their best dresses. She never came back. At Terceira in the Azores, Captain Raphael Semmes was waiting. The Enrica was armed, 6 32-pounders, a 100-pounder Blakely rifle, and an 8-inch pivot smoothbore, and commissioned as CSS Alabama on the 24th of August, 1862. What followed was 22 months of destruction, 75,000 nautical miles, 65 Union merchant ships taken or burned, 1 United States warship, USS Hatteras, sunk in combat. The Alabama became the most successful commerce raider in the history of naval warfare, and she'd been built in plain sight on the banks of the Mersey by Birkenhead men, using Birkenhead iron. She met her end off Cherbourg on the 19th of June, 1864, sunk by USS Kearsarge in roughly an hour. Semmes survived, plucked from the water by an English yacht, but the diplomatic consequences would outlast every ship involved. The United States demanded compensation from Britain for breach of neutrality. The Treaty of Washington in 1871 led to the Geneva Tribunal of 1872, which awarded the Americans $15.5 million in gold, a foundational precedent in international arbitration, and a bill that the British Treasury traced directly back to a Birkenhead slipway. The Lairds weren't finished. In October 1863, the yard was caught building 2 armoured turret rams under the cover names El Tusun and El Monastir, Confederate warships disguised as Egyptian contracts. This time, the Royal Navy acted. Marines from HMS Majestic and HMS Heron seized the vessels at the yard. John Laird himself sued the British government, arguing the construction didn't violate the act. He lost. The seizure of the Laird rams marked the end of Confederate procurement on Merseyside. But the story didn't die. A folk shanty, Roll, Alabama Roll, would carry the yard's name for a century and a half. 'Twas laid in the yard of Jonathan Laird, 'twas laid in the town of Birkenhead. Jules Verne, who'd visited Birkenhead in 1859, would name Laird's of Liverpool as the source of iron plates for the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Literary scholars have since linked Captain Nemo to Captain Semmes, Mobile Alabama to Verne's motto, Mobilis in Mobile. The yard that built boilers in a tidal pool had changed the course of an American Civil War, reshaped international law, and written itself into fiction, and it hadn't yet built a single battleship. Chapter 3. The Marriage of Steel and Salt Water. The battleships came because of a man from Hull. Charles Cammell was born in 1810, the 4th son of a shipmaster named George Cammell. He was apprenticed to an ironmonger, moved to Sheffield in 1830, and found work at Ibbetson's Globe Works as a commercial traveller, selling steel, not making it. By 1837, he'd saved enough to start his own firm, Johnson, Cammell and Company, with 2 partners named Thomas and Henry Johnson, manufacturing files and steel in Furnival Street. Sheffield in the 1840s was the cutlery capital of the world, and rapidly becoming its steel capital too. Cammell built the Cyclops Steel and Iron Works off Savile Street in 1845, and when the Johnsons retired a decade later, restyled the firm as Charles Cammell and Company. He began making railway rails in 1861. 2 years later, he began making armour plate for warships. That was the strategic turn. The Royal Navy's ironclad building programme was accelerating. The Admiralty wanted armour that could stop shells at close range, and Sheffield was the only city in the world that could reliably roll it in the thicknesses required. Cammell floated the company in 1864 with a capital of £1 million and expanded the Cyclops works to encompass the adjoining Howard and Agenoria works. Then, after Kaiser Wilhelm II's accession in 1888 triggered a new arms race, Cammell built the Grimesthorpe Ordnance Works and the Cathedral Mill Bay, 310 feet long, 64 feet wide, 50 feet high, one of the great cathedrals of British industrial steel. The logic of the merger that followed was simple. By the 1890s, Laird brothers at Birkenhead were building battleships for the Royal Navy and cladding them in armour plate shipped from Sheffield by Charles Cammell and Company. The Admiralty preferred contractors who could armour their own warships in-house. In 1903, Cammell acquired the Laird brothers' shipyard, and the combined entity became Cammell, Laird and Company Limited. The merger created something formidable. Sheffield provided the steel. Cyclops, Grimesthorpe, Penistone. Workington provided pig iron from the Derwent furnaces. Maryport contributed the Solway Iron Works. Barnsley supplied coal from the Oaks collieries. And Birkenhead built the ships, on a yard that now expanded to 98.5 acres at Tranmere, incorporating Britain's largest private wet dock. The First World War tested it. 5 C-class light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 escort vessels, 8 submarines, 3 standard tramp steamers, 2 tankers, and the conversion of civilian liners into seaplane carriers. Over 500 ships repaired, and HMS Caroline launched on the 29th of September 1914. A C-class light cruiser built in 9 months from keel to launch, the fastest construction of a significant warship the world had ever seen. She fought at Jutland in 1916. She survives today, preserved in Belfast, the only Jutland veteran still afloat, and she was built at Birkenhead. The yard also founded a national projectile factory at Nottingham in 1915, reorganised 2 years later as a national ordnance factory, turning out 18-pounder field guns and 6-inch guns. Cammell Laird wasn't just building ships for the war, it was arming the armies that fought alongside the fleets it launched. By 1918, the integrated steel and shipbuilding complex stretched from the coalfields of Barnsley to the Cumbrian coast to the banks of the Mersey. One company, rooted in 2 men's ambitions, a Greenock boilermaker and a Hull ironmonger's apprentice, now supplied the raw material, forged the armour, and built the warships that carried it into battle. In 1929, the railway rolling stock side of the business was spun off into the Metropolitan Cammell Carriage and Wagon Company. The shipyard kept building, and what it built next would define the century. Chapter 4. 3 ships. On the 13th of April 1937, Lady Maud Hoare broke a bottle of champagne against the bow of HMS Ark Royal, and 30,000 people lining the Birkenhead slipway watched as the largest warship ever built on the Mersey slid into the water. She was the first British ship designed from the keel up as a fleet aircraft carrier, not a battle cruiser conversion, not a compromise, but a purpose-built floating airfield carrying 60 aircraft and 1,500 crew. Her keel had been laid in 1935, the year Hitler announced German rearmament. By the time she was completed in 1938, the carrier she'd been designed for a theoretical future war was needed for a real one. Her war lasted 3 years. Her Swordfish torpedo bombers crippled the Bismarck in May 1941, the strike that turned a fleeing battleship into a sitting target for the home fleet's guns. 6 months later, on the 14th of November 1941, a single torpedo from U-81 struck her starboard side off Gibraltar. She capsized and sank the following morning. 1 man died. The ship that had turned the tide against the Bismarck was gone, and Birkenhead had already laid down her successors. 2 years before Ark Royal launched, on the 1st of January 1937, the yard laid the keel of a King George Fowd-class battleship originally designated King Edward VIII. The abdication crisis intervened. The ship was renamed HMS Prince of Wales. She was launched on the 3rd of May 1939, 4 months before Britain went to war. She was still fitting out in August 1940 when German aircraft damaged her at the yard, the enemy reaching Birkenhead before the ship had even left. She was commissioned on the 19th of January 1941 and within 4 months was in action at the Denmark Strait alongside HMS Hood, engaging the Bismarck. Hood blew up. Prince of Wales, with her turrets still jamming from incomplete working up, scored 3 hits on the Bismarck, including one that ruptured a fuel tank and contaminated a boiler room, crippling the German battleship's range and forcing the pursuit that ended her. A Birkenhead-built carrier and a Birkenhead-built battleship together brought down the most feared warship in the Atlantic. Prince of Wales then carried Churchill across the Atlantic to Argentia, Newfoundland, where the Prime Minister and President Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter, the founding document of the post-war order, drafted on a Cammell Laird deck. On the 10th of December 1941, she was sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya, with Captain John Leach and Vice Admiral Tom Phillips lost. The sinking marked the end of the battleship era. The weapon that had dominated naval warfare for 3 centuries was finished, and one of the last to prove it had been built on the Mersey. Between these 2 ships came the commercial pinnacle, RMS Mauretania, not the original Tyneside record breaker, but her successor, was launched on the 28th of July 1938 by Lady Bates. At 35,738 gross registered tons, she was the largest merchant ship ever built in an English yard. She served as a troop ship during the war, carrying over 335,000 troops, more than 500,000 miles. And then the war came properly, and the yard stopped building landmarks and started building everything. 106 warships in 6.5 years, 28 merchant ships alongside them, over 2,000 vessels repaired. That is 1 new warship every 20 days, sustained for the duration while the Luftwaffe was bombing the yard during the May 1941 Blitz, and 20,000 men and women were working across Merseyside's ship repair network. Cammell Laird, Harland and Wolff, Archibald Brown, Grayson Rollo, keeping the Battle of the Atlantic supply line stitched together. The production list included S-class and T-class submarines, destroyers, sloops, and the ruler-class escort carrier HMS Venerable, each one launched from the same slipways where John Laird had built his iron lighters a century before. The scale had changed beyond recognition. The mud of Wallasey Pool hadn't. Chapter 5. The Cathedral of Noise. A lad arriving for his first shift at Cammell Laird in the early 1960s would hear the yard before he saw it. The riveting, pneumatic guns hammering steel carried across the Mersey and into Liverpool, a percussive bass line that residents on the far bank had grown up with, the way coastal towns grow up with the sound of gulls. Underneath the riveting was the grind of plate cutting, the rumble of overhead cranes traversing their rails, the intermittent thunder of steel sections dropped into place, and the works hooter that marked the shifts and could be heard as far as Rock Ferry. 12,000 men worked there in 1961. That number needs context. 12,000 men in a single shipyard is a small town's entire working population arriving at the same gate every morning. They came from Birkenhead, from Tranmere, from Bebington and Rock Ferry, on foot and by bicycle, and packed into buses that queued along the approach roads. The Albertina family alone sent 5 brothers through the gates: Billy, Eddie, Francis, Jimmy and John. Multi-generational, multi-sibling employment wasn't unusual. It was the pattern. Your father had worked there, his father before him. The yard wasn't a job, it was an inheritance. Eddie Marnell joined as a 16-year-old apprentice shipwright in 1964. In the early years, he'd later recall, Cammell Laird's was a good firm, a family business and a happy place to work. There were over 7,000 workers then. 7,000, already down from 12,000 just 3 years earlier, though the young Marnell wouldn't have known that. The number was still vast enough to feel permanent. An apprentice's account from 1948, preserved by his son on a blog titled Memories of Cammell Laird's Shipyard, describes the canteen with its wooden benches, its cod's head curry and rubber-fried eggs. The donkey-dick handcart initiation rite that every new boy endured. A dead cat floating in the sulfuric acid tank outside the machine shop that nobody seemed concerned about. And, moored to the quay wall as casually as a narrowboat on a canal, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, not the wartime ship, but her successor, HMS Ark Royal RR09, 53,060 tons, launched by Queen Elizabeth herself on the 3rd of May 1950. The first reigning monarch or consort ever to launch a Mersey-built ship standing on the same slipway where Prince of Wales had entered the water 11 years before. That second Ark Royal was the world's first aircraft carrier, fitted with steam catapults and an angled flight deck as built, not retrofitted, but designed into the hull from the start. She served from 1955 to 1979, the last conventional fixed-wing carrier the Royal Navy would operate, until the Queen Elizabeth class arrived decades later, and she was just one item on a post-war list that read like a catalogue of firsts. In 1956, the yard launched SS Leader, a 30,000-ton ore carrier, the largest of her type in the world. In 1959, the tanker Oris became the first petroleum carrier ever powered by gas turbines. The same year, Windsor Castle, 36,277 tons for the Union Castle line to South Africa, became the largest passenger liner Cammell Laird had ever built. In 1960, HMS Devonshire slid down the ways as Britain's first guided missile destroyer. By 1963, the yard had won subcontract work on the Polaris ballistic missile submarines HMS Renown and HMS Revenge, entering the nuclear submarine program that would define British naval deterrence for the rest of the century. The yard's physical footprint had grown to match. 98.5 acres of slipways, dry docks, fitting-out basins, fabrication shops and cranage, with Britain's largest private wet dock at its heart. The cranes formed a permanent feature of the Liverpool waterfront skyline, visible from the Royal Liver Building, from Albert Dock, from the decks of the Mersey ferries that carried commuters and tourists past the yard every day. You couldn't look across the Mersey from Liverpool without seeing Cammell Laird. It was as much a part of the waterfront as the Three Graces, and the community around it was built in its image. Cammell Laird Football Club, founded in 1907, played at the old Prenton Park, and then at the Kirklands ground in Rock Ferry from 1922. The Laird's Sports Club opposite the ground. The Cammell Laird Institute on Conway Street. The Cammell Laird Social Club, later immortalised by the Birkenhead band Half Man, Half Biscuit, who named their 2002 album after it, because on Merseyside the yard wasn't just an employer, it was a cultural landmark. The pubs, the clubs, the chip shops, the terraced streets, all arranged around the gravitational pull of the gates. John Laird's Victorian paternalism had set the pattern. The dock cottages for workers, the School of Art, the Borough Hospital. A century later, the workers had built their own institutions on the same foundations. The yard gave Birkenhead its identity, not Liverpool's Shipyard. Birkenhead people will correct you sharply on that point, and they're right. Across the Mersey from Liverpool, same metropolitan county since 1974, historically Cheshire, the tunnel and the ferries connect them. The rivalry separates them. Birkenhead is its own place, and Cammell Laird is the reason it exists. Chapter 6. The View from the Summit. In 1963, when the yard won the Polaris subcontract work, a reasonable man standing at the gates of Cammell Laird would have seen a shipyard with almost a century and a half of continuous operation behind it, and as far as the eye could see, a future secured by the Cold War's insatiable appetite for naval tonnage. The Admiralty needed submarines. Britain needed carriers. NATO needed escorts. And Birkenhead, with its wet dock, its cranage, its fabrication capacity, and its 12,000 pairs of hands, was one of only a handful of yards in the country that could deliver them. The order book stretched forward. The workforce, though down from its 1961 peak, was still measured in thousands. The town still breathed in time with the shifts, but the numbers that mattered weren't on the Mersey. They were in the Pacific. Britain's share of world merchant shipbuilding had been falling for decades, from roughly half the global total at the turn of the century to about 40% by 1950. The slide was gradual enough to ignore, and British yards had the naval contracts to cushion the decline. Then Japan industrialised its shipbuilding sector with a single-mindedness that made the British effort look artisanal. Between 1962 and 1970, Japanese shipyard productivity grew by 341%. British productivity in the same period grew by 20%. The gap wasn't closing. It was opening so fast that by the end of the 1960s, the question wasn't whether Britain could compete with Japan for merchant orders. It was whether there was any point in trying. Korea was already visible behind Japan, building the same ships at even lower cost. The model that had sustained British shipbuilding for a century, high skill, high wages, complex vessels, long build times, A domestic customer base that preferred British yards out of habit and patriotism was being undercut by yards that could deliver comparable hulls in half the time for a fraction of the price. At Birkenhead, the immediate threat wasn't foreign competition. It was something closer to home. The demarcation disputes that had plagued British shipbuilding for decades, which trade could drill a hole, which trade could weld a bracket, which union held jurisdiction over a pipe fitting, had erupted in 1956 into a full jurisdictional strike between shipwrights and boilermakers that halted construction for over 6 months. Japanese yards didn't have demarcation disputes. Japanese workers moved between tasks as the job required. The comparison was devastating, and every Admiralty procurement officer could see it. The yard's dependency on defence contracts was simultaneously its lifeline and its vulnerability. As long as the Royal Navy kept ordering, Birkenhead could survive regardless of what Korea and Japan did to the merchant market. But defence orders depended on defence budgets, and defence budgets depended on politics. And politics in the 1970s was about to change everything. Standing at those gates in 1963, you'd have seen the cranes, the ships, the men arriving for the morning shift. You'd have heard the riveting carry across the water. You'd have smelled the ozone of the welding, the paint, the salt air off the Mersey. And if someone had told you that within 20 years the workforce would be halved, the yard nationalised, and 37 of those men imprisoned in a maximum security jail under a law traced back to the medieval monks of Birkenhead Priory, you'd have thought them mad. Nobody standing at the summit ever sees the cliff. Chapter 7. Stony Ground. The nationalisation, when it came, arrived not as rescue, but as absorption. The Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act of 1977 brought Cammell Laird into British Shipbuilders, a state holding company headquartered in Newcastle. The yard lost its independence, not to a competitor, not to a foreign buyer, but to a government that believed the only way to save British shipbuilding was to gather every surviving yard under one roof and manage the decline. The workforce at nationalisation stood at 5,500. Within 6 years, it would be 3,300. The orders were still coming, naval work mostly, the Cold War still generating enough demand to keep the slipways occupied, but the commercial contracts that had once produced Mauretania and Windsor Castle had migrated east. Korea and Japan didn't just undercut on price, they delivered faster, with fewer disputes, in yards designed for volume production, rather than Victorian craft tradition. Cammell Laird converted to mixed yard status, bidding for non-naval work and EU intervention funding. It was an acknowledgement that the old model, the model that had sustained the yard since 1903, was broken. Then the political weather turned. In March 1984, the National Coal Board announced a programme of pit closures, and the miners' strike began. On the 18th of June, the Battle of Orgreave set mounted police against pickets in South Yorkshire. And in the background, a detail the national press barely registered, the same forces were converging on the banks of the Mersey. By May 1984, British shipbuilders had reduced Cammell Laird's order book to 2 projects, the Type 42 destroyer HMS Edinburgh and a partly built jack-up gas accommodation rig designated AV-1. With just 1,700 workers left, British shipbuilders announced a further 1,000 redundancies. The workforce did the arithmetic. 2 projects, 700 jobs after the cuts, and a persistent fear, documented in union minutes and worker testimony, that British shipbuilders intended to tow the 2 part-built vessels away to be completed elsewhere, possibly in France. In late June 1984, days after Orgreave, they occupied the rig. Billy Albertina, staging department shop steward, one of the 5 Albertina brothers, led the occupation of the gas rig. Eddie Marnell, the apprentice who'd joined at 16 in 1964, was a shop steward by now. The men who climbed onto that cold steel platform weren't radicals imported from somewhere else. They were Birkenhead men whose fathers and grandfathers had walked through the same gates, who'd served their apprenticeships in the same workshops, and who understood with absolute clarity that if the rig left the yard, their jobs left with it. The occupation lasted 14 weeks. The men slept on the rig, smuggled food past the perimeter, banged oil drums at night. Water and electricity were cut. Police laid barbed wire around the rig's legs. Albertina's instruction to his men was specific and unwavering. On no account would any of them commit violence or damage. This was not Orgreave. There were no mounted charges, no flying bricks. There was a group of shipyard workers sitting on a steel platform in the Mersey rain, refusing to come down. On the 23rd of August 1984, Cammell Laird sacked the strikers. In early September, British shipbuilders began civil court action for trespass, and here the story acquires a detail so peculiar it sounds invented, except that it appears in Hansard, in academic papers, and in the testimony of the men themselves. Geoffrey Howe, then Foreign Secretary, the same man who had privately urged Margaret Thatcher not to spend public money on Merseyside, calling it Stony ground in a memo later released under the 30-year rule, is reported to have unearthed an antiquated legal provision associated with the monks of Birkenhead Priory. The priory, founded around 1150, is the oldest building on Merseyside, a Benedictine monastery whose medieval legal provisions were dusted off 800 years later to provide the basis for contempt of court proceedings against shipyard workers occupying a gas rig on the same stretch of river the monks had once ferried pilgrims across. Around the 3rd of October 1984, after 14 weeks, with food supplies dwindling and the legal noose tightening, the men came down. They were arrested as they descended. 37 men were sentenced in absentia to 30 days imprisonment in HMP Walton, Merseyside's Category A maximum security prison, for contempt of court. They served 4 weeks in solitary confinement. Billy Albertina, Eddie Marnell, Francis, Jimmy and John Albertina, Tommy Webb, Lowell Duffy, Sam Morley, John Brady. 37 names read into Hansard decades later, the largest group of Britons imprisoned for trade union action in the 20th century. All 37 were sacked, blacklisted, lost their redundancy rights and their pensions, one man's loss estimated by the GMB at over £120,000. 2 apprentices who'd refused to cross the picket line were also dismissed. By 2025, at least 14 of the 37 had died, including Christopher Whitley, whose brother Mick would later serve as the Member of Parliament for Birkenhead. In 2014, the European Parliament ruled there had been no legal basis for their imprisonment and called on the UK government to apologise. No apology came. Hansard debates in 2023 and December 2025 continued to demand a public inquiry. 3 of the survivors, Eddie Marnell, Billy Albertina and Sam Morley, attended the 2023 debate. Solicitors from the Public Interest Law Centre and Doughty Street Chambers are still pursuing a Court of Appeal challenge. The medieval foundation of Birkenhead, the priory that gave the town its first purpose, had been used to imprison its own 20th century shipwrights. The irony was not lost on the men. It was simply too bitter to be called irony. Chapter 8. The Auction. In March 1986, Norman Tebbit approved the sale of Vickers Shipbuilding and Engineering Limited, VSEL, based at Barrow-in-Furness, including Cammell Laird, to a VSEL employee consortium for £60 million down and up to £40 million in profit share. The consortium beat Trafalgar House. VSEL floated on the London Stock Exchange on the 31st of July 1986. The deal carried an undertaking by VSEL to sign the contract for the first Trident ballistic missile submarine on improved terms. Every Trident boat would be built at Barrow. Cammell Laird's role would be confined to sub-component work, sections, not submarines. The strategic prize had gone to the parent yard. Birkenhead was the subsidiary. The workforce at privatisation was 2,100. The Cold War was entering its final act, though nobody at Birkenhead knew that yet. What they knew was that the order book was dominated by upholder-class diesel submarines for the Ministry of Defence, and that the Royal Navy's appetite for conventional submarines was not unlimited. The end of the Cold War arrived not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. The Options for Change Defence Review of 1990 slashed naval procurement budgets across the board. In October 1990, VSL announced Cammell Laird was for sale. The redundancies began again. By 1992, the picture was stark. Frank Field, the Member of Parliament for Birkenhead, stood in the Commons on the 14th of December and laid it out. The yard's order book consisted almost entirely of the remaining upholder-class boats. The commercial market was gone, lost to Korea, to Japan, to yards that could build a merchant hull for a fraction of Birkenhead's cost. Laird's had always supported the local area and bought its materials locally, Field told the House. Up to 6,000 indirect Wirral jobs were at risk, £30 million of annual spending power. In 1993, the last new build, HMS Unicorn, an Upholder-class diesel submarine, was completed and would later be sold to Canada, renamed HMCS Windsor. The workforce fell below 2,000 for the first time since 1931. VSEL announced the yard's closure. Barry Williams, the GMB official described in union circles as a communist firebrand, led the resistance. It wasn't enough. 160 years of continuous shipbuilding at Birkenhead ended. The slipways that had launched Ark Royal and Prince of Wales and Mauritania and CSS Alabama and 1,000 other ships fell silent. But the name had a stubborn quality. In the mid-1990s, a company called Coastline Group leased part of the yard as a ship repair facility. They bought it outright. In 1997, they floated on the London Stock Exchange under the resurrected Cammell Laird name and acquired yards at Teesside, Tyneside and Gibraltar. The strategy was expansion from repair into cruise ship conversion, taking old passenger vessels and making them bigger. It was a gamble. The company's entire future depended on winning and delivering large conversion contracts. In the year 2000, they won the one that would kill them. Chapter 9. The Tombstone in the Basin. The contract was worth around £50 million. The customer was Costa Classica, the Genoa-based cruise line owned by Carnival Corporation. The work was a jumboization, the fabrication of a brand-new pre-outfitted hull midsection, 146 feet long, 13 decks high, containing approximately 350 cabins to be welded into the existing cruise ship, Costa Classica. It would have added roughly 500 berths. The section was to be built on the slipway at Birkenhead, launched into the wet basin, and installed when the ship arrived from the Mediterranean. Construction began. Hundreds of skilled men, platers, welders, outfitters, electricians, worked through 2000 to build what was, in effect, a 13-story ship inside a ship. The contract was due to run through to March 2001. The midsection was, by workforce estimates, about 90% complete. In November 2000, Costa Classica sailed from the Mediterranean toward Birkenhead. Cammell Laird staff were already on board, marking out the cutting lines on the existing hull where the new section would be inserted. Chalk marks on steel. The geometry of a £50 million operation measured in white lines on a painted deck. Then the ship turned around. Mid-voyage, Costa Classica ordered Costa Classica back to Genoa. The stated reason was that Cammell Laird had failed to complete the new section on time and to the specified quality. Cammell Laird's position was that the section was substantially built and that Costa was in breach. On Merseyside, a different explanation took hold. Carnival Corporation had taken over Costa. The prevailing view among the workforce, expressed in union meetings, in the pubs around the yard, in testimony to MPs, was that Carnival had philosophically shifted to a model of commissioning large new-build cruise ships rather than modifying existing ones, and that the quality dispute was a pretext. This is contested. It has never been adjudicated as fact. What is fact is that the arbitration tribunal that sat in Italy 6 years later found unanimously for Costa on quality and timeliness grounds. The workforce's belief was their belief. The tribunal's finding was the tribunal's finding. Both are part of the record. What happened next was swift and irreversible. John Stafford, the chief executive of Cammell Laird Holdings, resigned in January 2001. Finance director John Schofield took over as acting chief executive and announced 450 redundancies as a direct result of the dispute. 700 jobs were immediately at risk across the group. The share price had already collapsed. Cammell Laird shares had reached a 12-month high of 147 pence. On the 24th of November 2000, when the dispute became public, they fell 39% in a single day and eventually bottomed at around 13 3/4 pence, the lowest since April 1998. The company had overdrafts of £29.7 million and posted a first-half pre-tax loss of £3.5 million on turnover of £52.7 million. The interim dividend was cancelled. On the 11th of April 2001, the Royal Bank of Scotland declined to roll over a £78 million bond instalment and refused to extend a £50 million loan facility. Cammell Laird Holdings entered receivership the same day. Total debts, approximately £150 million. Edward Klempke of PricewaterhouseCoopers, the man who had previously saved Swan Hunter, was appointed receiver. Within a week, PricewaterhouseCoopers announced a further 320 redundancies, 150 at Birkenhead, 60 on Tyneside, 110 on Teesside, where the yard was mothballed with a skeleton staff of 40. The gates were chained. The figure that matters on Merseyside is not the 320 direct redundancies. It is the estimated 6,000 indirect jobs across the Wirral supply chain, the subcontractors, the material suppliers, the canteens, the transport firms, the shops and pubs that depended on wage packets from the yard. Wirral Council estimated a possible 2 percentage point rise in local unemployment. Frank Field had said it years earlier. Laird's bought its materials locally. When the yard died, the money stopped circulating through the veins of the town. And in the wet basin at Birkenhead, visible from the Mersey, visible from the Liverpool waterfront, visible from every ferry that crossed the river, the midsection sat, 146 feet long, 13 decks, 350 cabins, thousands of tons of precision-engineered steel, the product of months of work by hundreds of skilled men, fully launched, fully floating, and absolutely useless. It sat there through the summer of 2001 and into 2002, a monument to a contract that should have secured the yard's future and instead ended its existence. In October 2002, the midsection was towed out of the Mersey, across the North Sea, to the Sheep Sloperige Breakers Yard in the Netherlands, the same facility that broke up the tricolour car carrier wreckage. The receivers were reportedly paid in the region of £750,000 for a structure that had cost roughly £52 million to build. 1.5 pence in the pound. One shipyard veteran on a Wirral online forum called it skilled men's life work. On the 27th of October 2006, the arbitration tribunal in Italy, chaired by Professor Pietro Trimarchi with Professor Guido Alpa and Lucio Crispo, ruled unanimously in favour of Costa Classica, finding that Cammell Laird had failed to perform on time and to specification. Cammell Laird Holdings, by then in administration, was ordered to pay undisclosed damages. KPMG administrators Roger Oldfield and Brian Green handled the claim. Costa publicly welcomed the ruling. The tribunal had spoken. The midsection was scrap. The yard was closed. The men were gone. But someone was still there. Chapter 10. The Man Who Stayed. John Sivert had been managing director of Cammell Laird during the late 1990s. He'd lived through the Costa Classica disaster, watched the receivership from inside, seen the gates chained and the workforce dispersed. And then, instead of leaving, he did something that nobody on Merseyside expected. He stayed. In 2001, A&P Ship Repair Group, Atlantic and Peninsula, acquired the Birkenhead, Teesside and Tyneside yards from the receivers. It was a salvage operation, not a resurrection. Ship repair, not shipbuilding. The ambitions that had driven the Costa Classica contract were dead. Sivert founded Northwestern Ship Repairers and Shipbuilders to lease parts of the Birkenhead yard and resume repair work. The scale was modest. The order book was thin, but the dry docks were intact. The wet basin still held water, and the cranes still stood on the waterfront. In 2005, A&P sold A&P Birkenhead to Northwestern. In January 2007, Peel Holdings, owners of Mersey Docks and Harbour Company and the driving force behind the Wirral Waters Regeneration Project, bought the entire site, with Northwestern retaining a long lease. The name came back. In 2007, Northwestern acquired the rights to the Cammell Laird name. On the 17th of November 2008, Northwestern Ship Repairers and Shipbuilders officially renamed itself Cammell Laird Ship Repairers and Shipbuilders Limited. The name that William Laird had brought to Wallasey Pool in 1824, that John Laird had built into a shipbuilding dynasty, that had launched Confederate raiders and aircraft carriers and battleships and ocean liners, was back above the gates. What followed was a reconstruction so slow and deliberate, it could only have been engineered by someone who understood exactly how fragile the yard's reputation had become. February 2008, a £28 million Ministry of Defence contract to overhaul RFA Fort Rosalie, the first major Royal Naval contract since the collapse. It was repair work, not new construction, but it put Cammell Laird back on the MOD's approved list. And in defence procurement, being on the list is everything. January 2010, a £44 million order for the flight decks of HMS Queen Elizabeth, the new Royal Navy aircraft carrier. Cammell Laird would fabricate massive steel sections at Birkenhead and barge them to Rosyth for final assembly. Block build contracts for both Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales followed under the Aircraft Carrier Alliance. May 2012. Preferred bidder for 2 Western Ferries car ferries, MV Sound of Seal and MV Sound of Soay. Small vessels, modest contracts, but they were complete new builds, the first at the yard since HMS Unicorn in 1993. 19 years of silence, broken by a pair of Scottish ferries. Then, in 2014, the contract that changed everything. Cammell Laird beat European, Korean and Singaporean yards for the £200 million contract to build the RRS Sir David Attenborough, a polar research vessel commissioned by the Natural Environment Research Council, Britain's biggest commercial shipbuilding project for 30 years. The contract was signed on the 19th of November 2015 by Sivret and NERC's Paul Fox. The keel was laid by Sir David Attenborough himself in October 2016. The hull was launched on the 14th of July 2018 before more than 3,000 spectators, the first time a crowd of that size had gathered at the Birkenhead waterfront since the Great Wartime launches. The public had voted to name the ship Boaty McBoatface. The name was kept, diplomatically, for the autonomous yellow research submarine carried on board. On the 26th of September 2019, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge stood on the Mersey slipway alongside Sir David Attenborough for the royal naming ceremony. The poet laureate, Simon Armitage, had written a poem, Ark, for the occasion. Sivret, who had spent 20 years rebuilding the yard from wreckage, stood and watched the future Queen of England name a ship on the same waterfront where Queen Elizabeth had launched Ark Royal in 1950. It has taken 20 years to regenerate this infrastructure, capability and capacity, Sivret said afterwards. This is the pride of Merseyside. The contracts kept coming. In October 2018, a £262 million 10-year future in-service support contract for all 4 Tide-class fleet tankers of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, Tide Spring, Tide Race, Tide Surge, Tide Force, supporting the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group. A further £357 million 10-year extension covered 5 more RFA vessels. Combined value, approximately £619 million, securing 300 jobs and over 100 apprenticeships. In September 2023, the yard was named in the BAE-led consortium for the Type 26 frigate programme, building sections of HMS Birmingham and HMS Belfast. The site today covers 130 acres, 4 dry docks, a non-tidal wet basin, and one of the largest covered modular construction halls in Europe. The workforce fluctuates with the contract cycle, 722 in early 2020, reduced by 178 redundancies during COVID, rebuilt to several hundred by 2024 with Type 26, RFA refits, and a new Mersey ferry under construction, well below 12,000, well above zero. Sivret was awarded the CBE in 2012. He stepped down as chief executive in May 2020, replaced by David McGinley, and remains a non-executive director. 43 years in the maritime sector, the man who stayed when everyone else left. Chapter 11. The River at Dusk. The cranes still stand on the Birkenhead waterfront. You can see them from the Royal Liver Building, from Albert Dock, from the deck of the Mersey ferry, as it makes the crossing it's been making since before William Laird arrived. They're smaller now than the ones that lifted Ark Royal's flight deck into place, and the skyline they punctuate is shared with the glass and steel of Wirral Waters, Peel Holdings' £4.5 billion regeneration promise. But they're working cranes, not heritage props. Ships are repaired in the dry docks. Frigate sections take shape in the fabrication hall. The welding flash still catches the Mersey at night. Walk south from the yard, and you reach Hamilton Square, where John Laird's bronze statue still holds his dock plans in his right hand. The square he built around himself is largely intact. Georgian terraces, Grade Y listed, that particular Birkenhead grandeur that has nothing to do with Liverpool and everything to do with a Scotsman who decided that a tidal pool deserved a town. Walk further and you find Birkenhead Priory, founded around 1150, the oldest building on Merseyside. The Benedictine monks who established it could not have imagined that their medieval legal framework would be invoked 8 centuries later to imprison shipyard workers. But that is what happened, and the men it happened to are still waiting. Eddie Marnell, Billy Albertina, Sam Morley, the surviving members of the Cammell Laird 37, are still campaigning. The European Parliament said their imprisonment had no legal basis. Hansard has recorded their names. Solicitors are preparing a Court of Appeal challenge. At least 14 of the 37 are dead. The apology hasn't come. Alan Small, a former apprentice, put it plainly for ITV. These lads weren't just fighting for their own jobs. They were fighting for our jobs, our futures, and basically the future of Birkenhead, really. The devastation. You can still see it today. You can. The scars of 2001, the Costa Classica receivership, the 6,000 indirect jobs, the money that stopped flowing through the terraced streets, are visible in boarded shop fronts and in the particular quietness of a town that was built to be louder. But the yard is there. A new ship is on the slipway. The apprenticeship program that Cyrette rebuilt is training the next generation of welders and platers, and some of them carry surnames that appeared on Cammell Laird's payroll a century ago. The midsection is gone. Scrapped in the Netherlands in 2002, £52 million of precision steelwork reduced to re-rolling stock for $750,000. Skilled men's life work, towed across the North Sea by foreign hands. There's no plaque for it, no memorial, just the wet basin where it sat for 18 months, visible from every ferry, a 146-foot tombstone for a contract that should have been the future. But the basin still holds water, and the yard that William Laird started with a boiler works, and his son turned into a dynasty, and his successors armed with Confederate raiders and aircraft carriers and battleships, the yard that employed 12,000 men and imprisoned 37 of them and collapsed for an Italian cruise ship and was brought back from the dead by a man who refused to leave. That yard is still building ships on the Mersey, not through grand rescue, not through government intervention, through one man's stubbornness, a slow accumulation of contracts, and the quiet persistence of a workforce that never entirely went away. The river runs past. The cranes stand. And somewhere in the fabrication hall, a welder strikes an arc on a piece of steel that will become part of a Royal Navy frigate, in a yard that has been doing exactly this, in one form or another, for 200 years. It hasn't stopped yet.